Feather's Dead Horse Gulch Escape and Christmas Kill, 1887. The winter of 1887 had wrapped Dead Horse Gulch in a thick, icy blanket. Snow covered the wooden rooftops and the narrow streets that twisted between the old mining cabins. The wind cut through the town like a sharp knife, and the only sounds were the occasional groan of a timbered building under the weight of snow, or the distant howl of a wolf. For the people of the Gulch, life was already hard, but this winter made it almost unbearable. Miners wrapped themselves in tattered coats, their breath visible in the cold air, while children ran through the streets with scarves pulled tight over their faces, their laughter echoing faintly but warmly against the frosty silence. Amid this quiet, one figure moved with careful steps, watching every shadow and listening to every sound. Feather, a man whose name had already begun to stir both fear and fascination, was not like most of the town's inhabitants. He was tall, lean, and quick, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. People said he had the mind of a fox and the courage of a lion, though courage was perhaps the wrong word. Feather had learned long ago that survival in a harsh world depended not on bravery alone, but on wit, patience, and the ability to vanish when others least expected it. Feather had spent the last few weeks quietly in Dead Horse Gulch, keeping to himself. He had taken shelter in an abandoned cabin near the outskirts of town, where the snow piled high against the walls. From there, he could observe the town without being seen, and he could move freely at night. Though he had spent his life as an outlaw of sorts, Feather never sought unnecessary trouble. He knew the risks of drawing attention in a town like this. Lawmen were vigilant, and the townspeople, though generally kind, were quick to turn against anyone who threatened their fragile peace. Yet even as Feather kept a low profile, news of his presence had begun to spread. Miners whispered about seeing a stranger moving through the snow, his boots leaving prints that disappeared as quickly as they were made. Some claimed to have glimpsed him in the town square at dusk, watching silently as families carried firewood to their cabins. Others told tales of him slipping through alleyways faster than the eye could follow. These stories were passed quietly from one person to another, growing slightly with each retelling. By the time Christmas approached, the legend of Feather had become almost larger than life. The townspeople were preparing for the holiday in their modest ways. A few families hung sprigs of pine and holly on their doors, and one brave miner even strung a few simple lights along the edge of the general store. Children carved small wooden toys and painted them with whatever colors they could find, while mothers baked simple bread and shared scraps of dried fruit. There was a warmth in these preparations that stood in stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. Feather, observing from his cabin, felt a strange tug of curiosity and admiration. Though he had never celebrated Christmas as a child, the sight of the town coming together in quiet cheer made him pause. He remembered, faintly, a simpler time before hardship had defined his life, before the roads had been filled with the danger, and the nights had been long and lonely. But the festive mood of Dead Horse Gulch could not reach Feather entirely. The news of lawmen tracking him had arrived in whispers and hints, carried by a miner who had once seen him ride fast through the hills. Feather knew the risks. If he stayed in town, he could be caught. If he tried to leave without planning, the winter wilderness could claim him. He had to choose carefully, weighing each option as if the life of a bird depended on it, moving silently and watching every detail. On the night before Christmas, Feather sat by a small fire in his cabin. The firelight flickered across the rough wooden walls, illuminating tools and scraps he had gathered for survival. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and snow piled against the door. Feather studied the map he had drawn in his mind and on scraps of paper tracing the paths that led out of the town and into the mountains beyond. He remembered the hidden trails, the places where he could find shelter, and the spots where water ran even in the harshest winter. Each detail mattered. One wrong step could spell disaster, but careful planning could allow him to slip away unnoticed. While he prepared, Feather also reflected on the life that had brought him here. Born to a family of miners, he had known hardship from the start. He had learned to move silently through the mountains, to read the land, and to survive when food and warmth were scarce. His life had been filled with choices, each one shaping the person he had become. By the time he had reached Dead Horse Gulch, he had already earned a reputation as someone who could disappear when needed. someone clever enough to evade capture, and someone cautious enough to survive where others might fail. As midnight approached, the town itself seemed to hold its breath. Smoke rose from chimneys and mingled with the fog that drifted over the snow, creating a soft, glowing haze. In the cabins, families huddled together, sharing warmth and stories. Feather, cloaked in a thick coat, slipped silently from his cabin and moved toward the edge of town. His movements were precise, his steps calculated to avoid noise. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of light was a signal to him, guiding his path and warning him of danger. Feather paused briefly on a small hill overlooking the town. The sight before him was both beautiful and melancholic. Lights twinkled faintly against the white snow, and the quiet cheer of families preparing for Christmas contrasted sharply with his own life of constant evasion and uncertainty. He felt a pang of something he could not name, nostalgia perhaps, or longing for a life that had always seemed just out of reach. Yet there was no time for hesitation. The lawmen were closing in, and he had to act quickly. Drawing a deep breath, Feather turned away from the town and toward the hidden trail he knew would lead him to safety. The path was narrow, winding between jagged rocks and snow-laden pines. He moved swiftly and silently, careful to cover his tracks and avoid detection. The cold bit at his fingers and nose, but he ignored it. Survival demanded focus, and Feather's mind was sharp and alert. Each step was measured, each sound noted as he navigated the darkness of the winter night. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, the town of Dead Horse Gulch was behind him, its lights faintly glowing through the snowy haze. Feather paused to take in the scene one last time, knowing that the life he had known there, brief as it had been, was now a part of his past. Ahead lay the wilderness, full of danger but also full of opportunity. He felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration, knowing that the night held both peril and promise. And so, under the quiet gaze of a winter sky filled with stars, Feather vanished into the snow and the shadows, beginning the first stage of a journey that would test his wit, endurance, and determination. The story of Dead Horse Gulch and its mysterious visitor had only begun, and the legend of Feather was already growing, carried on the whispers of miners, travelers, and townsfolk who would long remember the night when a clever man walked silently through their town and disappeared into the winter wilderness. Feather had slipped away from the edge of Dead Horse Gulch just as the first light of dawn began to touch the snow-covered peaks. The town behind him was quiet, the morning cold settling over the streets and cabins like a soft, white blanket. Feather knew that if he stayed in one place for too long, the pursuing lawmen, or even curious townsfolk, might spot him. He needed to move quickly, but he also needed to be smart. Every step had to be calculated, every decision weighed carefully. He had survived this long not through speed alone, but through observation, patience, and planning. The first challenge was the forest that lay beyond the gulch. The trees were tall and thick, their branches heavy with snow. Walking through it was not easy. The snow sometimes came up to his knees, and the branches often lashed his face as he moved. But the forest was also his protection. It hid him from prying eyes, muffled his footsteps, and gave him places to rest when needed. Feather moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the land well. Each tree, each rock, each snow-covered path was familiar to him in a way that outsiders could never understand. He paused occasionally to listen, hearing the soft rustle of animals, the distant crack of ice, and the gentle sigh of the wind. These sounds were his guide, and they reminded him that the wilderness was alive, watching as carefully as he watched it. Feather had a plan. Weeks earlier he had studied maps, talked to old miners, and remembered secret paths that were rarely used. There was a hidden trail along the cliffs on the far side of the forest, a trail that led to an abandoned cabin near a frozen creek. From there, he could reach the mountains beyond, where few dared to go in the dead of winter. But getting there required patience. The trail was narrow and winding, and a single misstep could send him tumbling into a deep ravine or leave footprints that would lead pursuers right to him. Feather moved slowly, deliberately, testing each step before putting his weight down. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, watching for any signs of danger, natural or human. As he traveled, Feather reflected on the skills that had brought him this far. He had grown up in the mountains, learning to hunt and fish, to read the weather and track animals, to build shelter from snow and wind. These skills had saved his life many times. He remembered the lessons his father had taught him as a boy. "The land will always tell you what you need to know," his father had said. "Listen, watch, learn, then act." Feather had never forgotten those words. They guided him now, giving him confidence that he could navigate the wilderness safely. The morning passed slowly, and by midday the sun had barely warmed the landscape. Feather needed food and shelter. The snow made it difficult to find much, but he had packed small supplies in his coat: dried meat, hard bread, and a few pieces of fruit. He paused near a cluster of trees and sat down on a fallen log. The cold bit at his fingers, but he ignored it as he ate slowly, savoring each bite. Every moment of rest was brief, because he knew the lawmen might be following, and the wilderness was full of unpredictable challenges. After eating, he wrapped his coat tighter around him and continued along the hidden trail, using his map and memory to guide him. By afternoon, the forest began to thin, and Feather reached the edge of a cliff that overlooked a frozen valley. The view was breathtaking. Snow-covered hills stretched as far as the eye could see, glinting in the pale sunlight. The valley below was dotted with frozen streams and patches of evergreens, untouched by human hands. Feather paused to take it all in. For a moment, the escape from Dead Horse Gulch felt almost like freedom, not just from the town or the lawmen, but from a life that had been full of constant pressure and danger. He felt a rare sense of peace, knowing that he was alone with the land, moving carefully but freely through a world that seemed timeless and vast. But Feather's mind quickly returned to the task at hand. The cliffside trail was treacherous. Loose rocks and hidden ice patches made footing uncertain. One slip could be disastrous. Feather moved slowly, placing his feet carefully and testing each step before shifting his weight. He leaned on his walking stick, using it to maintain balance and probe the snow for hidden hazards. The wind was strong here, whipping across the cliff and carrying with it tiny snowflakes that stung his face. Feather pressed on, determined to reach the safety of the abandoned cabin below, where he could rest, plan, and wait for nightfall. As he descended, he noticed the tracks of animals in the snow: deer, foxes, and smaller creatures. They reminded him of how life continued even in the harshest conditions, and he took note of their paths. Sometimes following animal tracks could lead to water or shelter, and he used this knowledge to guide his steps. The world was full of lessons for those who watched carefully, and Feather had spent his life learning them. By late afternoon, the trail brought him to the edge of a frozen creek. The abandoned cabin he had been aiming for stood quietly among the trees. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the walls were weathered and worn, but it was solid enough to provide shelter. Feather approached carefully, checking for signs of anyone else nearby. Finding none, he entered the cabin, closing the creaking door behind him. The interior was small and dark, but the firewood he had brought would be enough to light a small fire. He quickly arranged some wood and struck a match, watching the flames catch and grow. The warmth filled the cabin, bringing relief to his chilled body and a sense of security that had been absent for weeks. Inside, Feather allowed himself a moment to rest. He unrolled a small blanket and sat by the fire, listening to the wind outside and thinking about the journey ahead. He knew that staying in one place too long could be dangerous, but the cabin offered a temporary haven. From here, he could plan the next stage of his escape. He examined the maps he had made in his mind, tracing the routes that led farther into the mountains, through valleys and along rivers that few travelers used in winter. Each path had its challenges, but each also offered the chance to move further away from the town and the lawmen pursuing him. As evening approached, Feather prepared a simple meal from his remaining supplies. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire and the occasional sound of snow shifting outside. He thought about the town he had left behind, the families preparing for Christmas, and the life that continued there without him. Despite everything, he felt a strange connection to those people. The world was harsh, and survival was difficult, but there was still warmth and kindness even in places like Dead Horse Gulch. Feather allowed himself a small smile, appreciating the thought. before focusing again on his own journey. Night fell, and the darkness of the forest deepened. Feather kept watch, knowing that he might be followed, but also taking time to rest. The stars shone brightly above, and the snow reflected their light, creating a quiet glow in the night. He felt a mixture of caution and exhilaration. Each moment brought him closer to safety, but also reminded him of the challenges ahead. He was alone, relying on his skills, his wits, and his knowledge of the land. Every choice mattered, every step was important, and every sound in the forest could carry a warning. As he settled into the cabin for the night, Feather reflected on what had brought him here. His life had been shaped by the mountains, by the harsh winters, and by the lessons of survival. Each experience had prepared him for this journey, for the careful, measured escape from Dead Horse Gulch. He knew that the days ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he was ready. With patience, skill, and determination, he could move through the wilderness, avoid detection, and reach a place of safety where he could rest and plan the next stage of his journey. The night passed slowly. Feather kept the fire burning, using the light and warmth to maintain focus and stay alert. Outside, the snow fell silently, covering the tracks he had left behind and erasing evidence of his passage. By morning, he would continue his journey, moving further from the town and deeper into the wilderness. Each day was a test, each step a challenge, but Feather was prepared. The forest was alive with secrets, and he had learned to read them all. With careful planning and steady determination, he would find the path that led to freedom. Feather left the cabin at dawn, stepping carefully onto the snow-covered trail. The morning air was crisp and clear, with sunlight reflecting off the icy surfaces of the forest. Each breath formed a small cloud, and the sound of his footsteps was muffled by the deep snow. The world seemed quiet, almost suspended in time, but Feather knew that the wilderness was full of both beauty and challenge. Every step required attention. Every movement needed careful planning. The mountains ahead were wild and steep, and the path would test him in ways the town of Dead Horse Gulch never had. The first challenge was the snow itself. It was soft in some places, thick and heavy in others, making progress slow and tiring. Feather adjusted his pace, moving steadily but not too quickly, conserving his strength. He scanned the surroundings constantly. The forest was alive with small sounds, the rustling of branches, the distant call of a bird, the faint crackle of ice under the weight of snow. These sounds were like a map to him. Each movement of an animal, each shift in the wind, told him something about the land, helping him choose the safest paths and avoid dangerous spots. Water was essential, and Feather knew that staying hydrated was important even in winter. He found a partially frozen stream and carefully collected a small amount of water, using a tin cup he had carried with him. The water was icy, but refreshing. He drank slowly, mindful of conserving energy, and took a moment to rest while sitting on a snow-covered rock. Around him, the forest seemed calm, but he remembered that winter wilderness could be unpredictable. A sudden snowstorm or a hidden patch of ice could make a simple walk dangerous. Feather's attention never wavered, his mind always calculating, always planning the next move. The mountains loomed ahead, jagged and imposing. Feather had learned long ago that the mountains were both a friend and a challenge. They offered shelter, hiding places, and routes that few travelers dared to take, but they also demanded skill, patience, and endurance. Feather moved along the lower slopes first, carefully following ridges and valleys. He avoided open spaces where footprints could be easily seen. He remembered the old lessons from his childhood. When the snow is deep, follow animal trails. They often lead to safer areas and even sources of food. He occasionally spotted deer tracks or small animal paths, and he adjusted his route to follow them, knowing they often led to shelter or water. As he climbed higher, the cold grew sharper. The wind swept across the slopes, carrying icy particles that stung his face. Feather wrapped his scarf tightly and kept moving, using his walking stick to test each step on the snow and ice. One slip could lead to injury or delay, and he could not afford either. Despite the physical challenge, he felt a sense of exhilaration. The wilderness was testing him, yes, but it also reminded him of the strength he had gained over the years. Each careful step was proof of his resilience. Each breath of cold air a reminder that he was alive and capable. Food was another concern. Feather had packed carefully, but supplies were limited. He used what he had wisely, rationing dried meat and bread, and occasionally stopping to gather nuts and edible plants. Winter made this harder, as much of the vegetation was buried under snow, but his knowledge of the land guided him. He could identify which plants would survive the cold and which could be safely eaten. This skill, developed over years of living close to nature, gave him confidence. Survival was not just about speed or strength, it was about knowledge, patience, and making smart choices. Hours passed, and Feather found a small, sheltered area among rocks and pine trees to rest. He built a tiny snow wall to block the wind and set up a small fire with dry wood he had collected along the way. The fire's warmth was comforting, and he sat close to it, stretching his tired muscles and allowing himself a brief moment of reflection. The wilderness was beautiful and unforgiving at the same time. He thought about the town he had left behind, and the people who had wondered about his disappearance. He felt no regret for leaving. The town was safe, and he had done what he needed to survive. But there was a quiet longing in his heart, a sense of connection to the world he had temporarily abandoned. As evening approached, Feather prepared for the night. The temperatures would drop sharply, and he needed to be ready. He wrapped himself in a thick blanket and reinforced his small snow wall to block the wind. He checked the fire, ensuring it would last for warmth through the night, and he stored his food carefully to keep it safe from wildlife. As he settled down, he kept one eye on the forest outside, alert to any movement, but also appreciating the stillness. There was something humbling about being alone in such vast surroundings, relying only on your own knowledge and instincts to survive. The night was long and quiet. Feather lay awake at times, listening to the wind and the distant sounds of the forest. The snow shifted softly, the branches creaked under its weight, and every sound became part of his awareness. He reflected on his life, the choices that had led him here, and the lessons that had prepared him for this moment. Each day in the wilderness was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity to prove his skill, patience, and intelligence. Survival was not just about reaching the next day. It was about moving with purpose, thinking ahead, and respecting the land that gave both life and challenge. By morning, the snow had thickened, covering even the faint tracks he had left behind. Feather stood and stretched, feeling the cold bite at his cheeks but also feeling renewed strength. The trail ahead was uncertain, but he had learned to read the signs. Small changes in the snow, the wind's direction, and even the behavior of birds and animals helped him choose the safest path. He moved carefully, climbing higher into the mountains where the forest thinned, and the land opened into rocky slopes. These higher elevations were more dangerous, but they offered greater protection from anyone who might be following. Feather encountered occasional obstacles, frozen streams that required careful crossing, steep slopes that tested his balance, and dense patches of snow-laden pine that slowed his progress. But each obstacle was met with calm determination. He remembered the lessons from his childhood and his years surviving the wilderness. Slow, steady, careful steps were better than rushing and risking mistakes. He adapted to the terrain, moving with a rhythm that allowed him to conserve energy while making progress. By midday, he reached a plateau that overlooked a wide valley. From here, he could see the land stretching far into the distance, with forests, frozen streams, and hills rolling away under the winter sun. Feather paused to rest, to eat a small portion of his rations, and to plan his next move. The journey was far from over, but the view reminded him why he kept going. The wilderness was challenging, but it was also beautiful, full of quiet wonders that few people ever experienced. Each step forward was a step into freedom, and Feather felt a deep satisfaction in his ability to move safely through this vast, icy world. As evening approached, he found a sheltered spot among a cluster of large boulders. He built a small fire, carefully arranging stones to block the wind and conserve heat. He ate the last of his dried food and took a moment to reflect. The journey through the mountains was more difficult than he had expected, but he was prepared. His knowledge of the land, his careful planning, and his determination had allowed him to survive so far. Each challenge he faced was a test, not only of skill, but also of patience and resilience. The night came, and Feather settled beside the fire. The stars shone brightly above, their light reflecting off the snow, creating a serene glow that contrasted with the harshness of the cold. He listened to the quiet sounds of the forest, aware of every movement, but also appreciating the peacefulness. This was a moment of calm and a journey full of uncertainty. Feather knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more careful steps, and more decisions that could mean the difference between safety and danger. But he was ready. He had survived this long, and he would continue to move forward, using every skill and every lesson he had learned to guide him through the wilderness. By the time he finally rested, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers. Feather wrapped himself in his blanket, closing his eyes briefly, but never fully letting his guard down. The wilderness was alive, full of surprises, and he respected it deeply. Each day in this frozen landscape tested him, shaped him, and reminded him of the importance of knowledge, patience, and careful action. And so, as the cold night enveloped the mountains, Feather slept lightly, ready to continue his journey at dawn, moving further from Dead Horse Gulch and deeper into the wild winter world that both challenged and protected him. The cold air stung his cheeks, but the quiet of the mountains brought a strange sense of calm. The snow around him was untouched, smooth, and sparkling in the first light of dawn. Feather stretched, rubbing his hands together to bring back warmth, and carefully inspected his small camp. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, enough to give him a few more minutes of comfort before he had to continue. He knew that the higher he climbed, the more difficult the path would become. The mountain slopes were steep, and the snow was thick, but he also knew that these remote areas offered safety and freedom from anyone who might still be tracking him. As he packed his few belongings and prepared to move, Feather thought about the next stage of his journey. He remembered the stories he had heard as a boy, about travelers who had been lost in these mountains and had survived by carefully observing the land and listening to its signs. Feather had learned long ago that the wilderness always communicates if one knows how to watch and listen. Even the wind, the direction of animal tracks, and the sounds of ice cracking could guide a person. He moved quietly, stepping carefully through the snow, his eyes scanning for signs that could help him choose the safest path forward. By late morning, Feather reached a narrow ridge that offered a view of the valley below. He paused to catch his breath and take in the scene. The valley was covered in snow, with frozen streams glinting like silver threads, and clusters of evergreen trees scattered across the landscape. The view reminded him of why he had chosen this life of careful movement and observation. Out here, far from towns and the rush of people, the world was pure and silent. It demanded respect and attention, but it also offered freedom. Feather felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that his skills had brought him this far and that he could continue to move safely through such harsh terrain. As he continued along the ridge, Feather noticed faint tracks in the snow. They were older than his own footprints and seemed to belong to someone who had been traveling carefully. He studied them closely. The tracks were deliberate, not hurried, suggesting a person who, like him, knew how to move quietly through the mountains. Feather decided to follow them at a distance, curious about where they might lead. Sometimes, following another traveler's path could lead to shelter, water, or food sources. Feather had learned to balance caution with curiosity, and this moment offered both. Hours passed, and Feather followed the tracks through a narrow canyon. The walls were steep, and snow hung heavily from the rocks above. He moved slowly, testing the ground before each step, careful to avoid loose stones and icy patches. The canyon was silent except for the occasional drip of melting snow and the crunch of his own boots. Feather noticed small signs of animal life. A fox's paw print here, a rabbit's burrow there. These signs gave him reassurance that the land was alive and that he was moving through it with awareness. It was not just about survival. It was about being in tune with the environment. Around midday, Feather reached a frozen waterfall. The ice sparkled in the sunlight, and he paused to admire the natural beauty. The waterfall was partially frozen, with water still trickling quietly beneath the ice. Feather had learned that places like this could be sources of water even in the dead of winter. He knelt beside the ice and carefully collected some water that had pooled in a natural basin. It was icy, but refreshing, As he drank, he thought about how much the wilderness had to offer, if one was patient and observant. Every detail, no matter how small, could make a difference between comfort and hardship. After a short rest, Feather continued along a ridge that gradually led him to a small plateau. There he discovered a cave tucked behind a formation of rocks. It was not large, but it was sheltered from wind and snow, and it offered a safe place to spend the night. Feather approached cautiously, scanning the area for signs of animals or other travelers. Finding none, he entered the cave and made a small fire with wood he had gathered from nearby trees. The warmth was comforting, and Feather felt a rare moment of relief. The cave offered protection and allowed him to rest while remaining hidden from anyone who might still be searching for him. As the day wore on, Feather prepared a simple meal. He had some dried fruit and a small amount of bread left from his supplies. Eating slowly, he allowed himself to enjoy the taste and the warmth from the fire. The wilderness was demanding, but it also rewarded careful planning and resourcefulness. Feather knew that every step, every decision, was part of a larger strategy to remain safe and continue moving forward. He spent some time organizing his belongings, ensuring that everything he had would be easy to carry and accessible. Later in the afternoon, Feather explored the surrounding area near the cave. He wanted to understand the terrain fully before settling in for the night. He noticed that the plateau offered a clear view of the valley below and the surrounding ridges. From this vantage point, he could see where snow had drifted heavily and where the ground was more stable. He marked these areas in his mind, knowing they might help him navigate in the days to come. Feather had learned that understanding the land was as important as physical endurance. Each observation could guide him towards safety and away from potential trouble. As evening approached, Feather built a small snow wall near the entrance of the cave to block the wind. He carefully tended his fire, making sure it would last through the night without drawing too much attention. He wrapped himself in his blanket and allowed himself a few moments of rest while listening to the quiet sounds of the mountains. The wind whispered through the trees, and the distant hills seemed to glow in the fading light. Feather felt a sense of accomplishment. He had navigated difficult terrain, found shelter, and remained safe. The journey was far from over, but he was prepared for the challenges ahead. Night fell, and the stars appeared in the clear winter sky. Feather sat by the fire for a while, reflecting on the day and planning for tomorrow. The mountains were both beautiful and demanding, requiring patience, skill, and attention to detail. Feather thought about the tracks he had followed, the paths he had chosen, and the lessons he had learned from the wilderness. Each experience added to his knowledge, making him more confident and capable. Survival was not only about endurance, it was about thinking, observing, and making smart choices. Feather prepared to sleep lightly, keeping one eye on the fire and another on the cave entrance. The wilderness was peaceful, but he knew it could change quickly. Snow might fall heavily overnight, covering tracks and creating new challenges, or wind could shift suddenly, making movement difficult. Feather understood the importance of being ready for any situation. As he closed his eyes, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The day had been long and challenging, but he had moved closer to safety and had proven once again that careful planning and knowledge of the land could guide him through even the harshest conditions. In the quiet of the night, Feather thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. From the town of Dead Horse Gulch to the frozen mountains, every step had been a lesson. He had learned to move silently, to observe closely, and to trust his instincts. The wilderness demanded respect, and he had given it through careful action and attention. Feather knew that the next days would bring more challenges, but he felt ready. Each challenge was an opportunity to test his skills and continue his journey safely. By the early morning hours, the fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft glow on the cave walls. Feather rested beside it, alert but comfortable, knowing that he had chosen wisely and that the mountains offered him protection. He drifted into a light sleep, dreaming of paths winding through snow-laden forests, ridges high above the valley, and streams glittering in the sunlight. He understood that the journey was far from over, but he felt capable, prepared, and determined to continue moving forward. The wilderness was both his challenge and his guide, shaping him with every step he took through its frozen expanse. Feather woke to the quiet of another winter morning. The snow lay thick on the plateau, untouched and sparkling in the first rays of sunlight. The fire he had built the night before had mostly burned down to embers, giving just enough warmth to make the morning bearable. He stretched, feeling the stiffness from the previous days of travel, and packed his small belongings with careful attention. Each item he carried had a purpose, whether for warmth, food, or survival. Feather knew that the wilderness was unforgiving, and that careful planning was the key to continuing his journey safely. The path ahead led him toward higher mountains and deeper valleys. Feather had studied the land carefully in his mind, memorizing the shapes of ridges, the flow of streams, and the locations of natural shelters. Though the journey was physically demanding, Feather felt confident. He had survived cold nights, treacherous slopes, and long hours of walking through snow and ice. Each step had strengthened not only his body, but also his understanding of the wilderness. He knew that the mountains would continue to test him, but he also knew that his knowledge and patience would help him succeed. As he walked along a narrow ridge, Feather spotted movement in the distance. At first, it was unclear whether it was an animal or another person. He stopped, crouching low, and studied the figures.
They were travelers, moving cautiously along the opposite slope of the valley. Feather observed them from afar, noting their pace and direction.
Though they were strangers, he felt a sense of curiosity rather than fear. The wilderness was full of people who, like him, understood its challenges. He watched quietly for a while, then adjusted his own route to avoid direct contact, careful to remain unseen. He had learned that blending with the environment was often the safest choice. The day passed slowly as Feather navigated rocky terrain and icy slopes. The snow, though beautiful, required constant attention. One misstep could result in a slip or fall, so Feather moved deliberately, testing the ground before placing his weight. He used his walking stick to probe hidden ice beneath the snow and to help maintain balance on steep inclines. Along the way, he noticed the tracks of animals, deer, rabbits, and birds, and used them to guide his path. Following these signs often led to safer areas, small water sources, and places where firewood could be gathered. Every detail mattered, and Feather's careful observation allowed him to make steady progress. By mid-afternoon, Feather reached the edge of a high valley. The view was breathtaking. Snow-covered hills stretched endlessly, and the sun reflected off frozen streams and rocks, creating a dazzling display of light. Feather paused, taking a moment to rest and admire the scene. Despite the hardships of the journey, there was a deep satisfaction in moving safely through such a challenging landscape. He had learned to respect the wilderness, to move with caution, and to adapt to its demands. Every step had required thought and care, and the beauty around him felt like a reward for his patience. Feather's journey was not only a test of endurance, but also a test of decision-making. He knew that winter storms could appear suddenly, changing the landscape and making travel dangerous. He studied the clouds, noting the movement of the wind and the shapes of the formations above. From these signs, he judged that he had several hours before the weather might turn. Using this information, he planned a route that would take him to a lower ridge by evening, where he could find shelter and rest safely. Feather had learned that survival was often about anticipation, predicting what might happen and preparing for it before it occurred. Along the way, he encountered a frozen stream that blocked his path. The ice was thick but uneven, with patches of water still visible beneath. Feather approached carefully, placing his walking stick on the ice to test its strength. He moved slowly, shifting his weight carefully to avoid breaking through. Each step required concentration, and Feather's patience ensured he crossed safely. Once on the other side, he paused to gather a few small pieces of dry wood from nearby trees. Even in winter, the land offered resources for those who knew how to find them. As evening approached, Feather reached a small, sheltered grove of evergreen trees. He could see that the slope here was protected from the strongest winds, making it a safe place to set up a temporary camp. Feather arranged a small snow wall to block the wind, built a fire, and prepared a simple meal from the last of his supplies. The warmth of the fire and the stillness of the forest created a sense of security he had not felt for several days. For the first time in a long while, Feather allowed himself to relax, knowing that he had navigated another difficult stretch successfully. Sitting by the fire, Feather reflected on his journey. He thought about the town he had left behind, Dead Horse Gulch, and the people who had lived there. Though he had avoided them intentionally, he felt a quiet connection to the community. They had lived their lives quietly, and he had observed them from afar. Now, as he moved deeper into the wilderness, he realized that his journey was not just about survival. It was about understanding himself, testing his abilities, and respecting the land that had become both a challenge and a guide. Night fell, and the stars appeared above, brilliant against the dark sky. Feather kept the fire burning low, enough to provide warmth and light without drawing attention. The silence of the forest was comforting, and he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had moved steadily, made careful decisions, and used his knowledge to navigate the winter wilderness. Each challenge had tested his patience, skill, and endurance, but he had met each one with confidence and intelligence. Feather understood that the journey ahead would continue to demand these qualities, but he felt ready. During the quiet of the night, Feather thought about the lessons he had learned from the mountains. The wilderness was not simply a place to move through. It was a teacher. Each ridge, stream, and forested slope offered lessons in observation, patience, and careful planning. Feather had learned to read the signs of the land, to follow animal tracks, to conserve energy, and to find shelter in the harshest conditions. These lessons had allowed him to move safely and confidently, and he knew they would continue to guide him in the days ahead. By morning, Feather prepared to continue his journey. The snow was still fresh and untouched, providing a smooth path for walking. He carefully packed his belongings, ensured the fire was fully extinguished, and checked the area for any hazards before moving. The day promised to be long, but Feather felt a quiet determination. He had survived this far through careful planning, patience, and attention to detail, and he trusted that these qualities would continue to serve him. As he moved along the next ridge, Feather spotted a small cabin in the distance. It was abandoned, like many others in the region, but it offered the possibility of rest, safety, and shelter from the winter elements. Feather approached cautiously, scanning the area for signs of wildlife or other travelers. Finding none, he stepped inside, carefully closing the door behind him. The cabin was small and simple, with a sturdy roof and walls that provided protection from wind and snow. Feather felt a sense of relief. The cabin would allow him to rest and prepare for the next leg of his journey without exposing himself to unnecessary risk.
Inside, Feather built a small fire and prepared a meal from his supplies. To explore built an unnecessary risk.
He sat quietly, listening to the wind outside and reflecting on the journey so far. The challenges he had faced, steep slopes, icy streams, and long hours of walking through snow, had tested his skill and endurance. Yet each challenge had also strengthened his confidence and sharpened his instincts. Feather understood that survival required both physical and mental strength, and he felt proud of the progress he had made. As night fell, Feather settled beside the fire, wrapped in his blanket. The mountains around him were quiet and still, and he felt a rare sense of peace. The journey had been long and demanding, but he had met each challenge with careful thought, patience, and determination. He knew that the future would continue to bring obstacles, but he also knew that he had the knowledge, skills, and resilience to overcome them. Feather drifted into a light sleep, ready to face the next day with the same careful attention and determination that had carried him this far. By the next morning, Feather packed his belongings and prepared to move deeper into the wilderness. He glanced back briefly, remembering Dead Horse Gulch and the town that had marked the beginning of this journey. Though the town was far behind him, its memory remained, a reminder of the life he had left and the challenges he had overcome. Feather stepped forward, confident in his abilities, aware of the lessons the mountains had taught him, and ready to continue his journey through the winter wilderness, where each day was a test, each step a challenge, and each moment an opportunity to prove his skill, patience, and resilience.